welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and yes, listeners, I have a big ol' summer cold, so I apologize for the hoarseness, the weirdness of my voice, but we are just going to power on through because we have a lot to discuss today in my episode all about the dogs of Agatha Christie. Let's go through some preliminary matters. I mentioned this in my last episode, but I am currently appearing in a YouTube series created by PBS SoCal, my local PBS station, called Won't You Be My Gamer? And in this multi-episode arc, I am the Agatha Christie expert who sits down with two gamers as they play through a video game adaptation of Murder on the Orient Express. I've already heard from a number of you that you enjoyed the first two episodes. There are two more episodes yet to be released. I am including a link to this show down in the notes, and I encourage you all to check it out. I think it's a lot of fun. I know I had fun recording it. Next, let's talk some spoilers. This is going to be a very spoiler-heavy episode, as all of my themed ranking episodes are turning out to be. And that's because I get to have a lot of fun talking in depth about a lot of different Agatha Christie titles. So, the following stories will be spoiled to some degree over the course of this episode. The Adventure of Johnny Waverly, Appointment with Death, The Capture of Cerberus, Death on the Nile, Dumb Witness, Elephants Can Remember, Five Little Pigs, The Flock of Geryon, Halloween Party, The Hound of Death, The Incident of the Dog's Ball, Lord Edgware Dies, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, The Moving Finger, Mrs. McGinty's Dead, Murder is Easy, The Murder on the Links, The Nemean Lion, Next to a Dog, Postern of Fate, and finally, The Secret Adversary. If you are worried about having any of those titles spoiled, you have been warned. All right, before I get to my episode proper, I have some housekeeping. I don't usually get the opportunity to do housekeeping in such rapid succession as this, but I got a ton of responses to my All About the Americans episode, which is where I will start now. Dusting off the first letter in the mailbag, here goes. I enjoyed your last episode on Americans and Agatha Christie, but I was dismayed to not have you mention my favorite American in Agatha Christie, Julius P. Hersheimer. Tommy and Tuppence's sidekick in The Secret Adversary. The one who almost snatched Tuppence away from Tommy. Not really, but he tried. He is such a great stereotypical Christie American. Solid name, a millionaire, of course, super energetic, and always ready to jump into action. He pretty much speaks using only American idioms, carries a gun on him, and according to Wikipedia, knows how to use it. Even though I am not a huge fan of the TNT thrillers, Julius holds a special place in my heart, and I think he deserves a place on your list. And that is not the only Julius P. Hersheimer message I got. Here's another one. Whilst I loved, as ever, your latest podcast, I was shocked that you missed Agatha's Best American. Winky smiley face. I genuinely thought he'd be in the top three, as to me, a dowdy and repressed Brit, he epitomized all the glamour and effusiveness of Americans. I don't remember exactly which was my first Agatha Christie, but The Secret Adversary was definitely a very early one. Like Tuppence, I was dazzled by one Julius P. Hersheimer. Who wouldn't like someone who puts you up at the Ritz and offers to buy you a Rolls Royce? I loved the way he threw money around and got hustling. I think he's also a great example of the hero or villain trope. Surely an honorable mention at least? And then here's one more. I really enjoyed your episode on Americans, but you missed one of my favorites, Julius P. Hersheimer in The Secret Adversary. He fits Christie's stereotype of the rich American with a ridiculous name and a dialogue of a type that no one has heard before. But he is a fabulous character with many great scenes. I first read the book when I was 9 years old, and I was captivated with Julius living at the Ritz and buying a Rolls Royce in half an hour because Tuppence mentioned one. Many years later, the book is nowhere near my favorite Christie, which it was at age 9. But Julius is still my favorite American in all of Christie. Thank you, listeners, for writing in. It was a shocking oversight. not to include Julius P. Hersheimer, because you're right. He is pretty much the archetype for the ridiculous American, ridiculously wealthy, ridiculously named, and ridiculously idiomatic. Julius deserves his moment in the sun. Moving on now to another shocking oversight of mine in the All About the Americans episode. I loved the latest episode all about the Americans featured in the Christie canon, but you seem to have forgotten one of the most prominent American families in all of Christie, the Boyntons in Appointment with Death. Not only is the family one of Christie's most interesting and psychologically complex, but Mrs. Boynton must surely be one of the most vivid characters in all of Christie and deserves to be near the top of your list, perhaps only second to Jane Wilkinson herself. I was also wondering if you'd ever consider doing a reread of any of the novels with a guest. I'm thinking particularly of Death Comes as the End, which I think deserves to be a bit higher on your list. I included that last bit just because people really do on a regular basis write in about Death Comes as the End. I hear all of you listeners, and I will be doing a reconsideration of Death Comes as the End at some point in the coming months. Have no fear. But this listener is absolutely correct. Mrs. Boynton is one of the greatest characters in Christie, and if I had remembered her, I would have slotted her in to the number 2 spot, just below Jane Wilkinson. And there's even an argument to be made that she should be above Jane Wilkinson, but you all know what a big fan I am of Lady Edgware. In my defense, I think that Mrs. Boynton is so hideous of a character that I forget she is American because I find her very being, her sort of intrinsic self, to be so overwhelming. That is the only defense that I can mount as to why I forgot Mrs. Boynton. I am so ashamed. Here was another listener response along those same lines. I really enjoyed the episode on overbearing Americans in Christie. I was glad that Odell Gardner from Evil Under the Sun got a mention. He always struck me as an unexpectedly well-formed person for such a minor character. Just pausing to say 100% agree with you. Really, really love Odell Gardner. Back to the message. But I was surprised the Boyntons from Appointment with Death didn't get discussed more, en masse, of course, since there are so many of them. It seems like in that book, we thematically get more of a view of how Americans were perceived by Christie and possibly British society or other cultures at large, since this book seems to have been inspired by her travels to Petra. Just as a couple of examples in the book, Sarah King notes that American boys are more worldly and have greater savoir-faire than British boys. The family friend Jefferson is described as friendly, like all the people of his race, meaning American, which always struck me as a strange way to describe it, and less reserved than Britons when traveling. There is much more scrutiny of what the characters expected Americans to be and how this family differed. And you will probably appreciate on some level that before writing this, I reread Appointment with Death to see if I had misremembered it. I had forgotten how many characters from Lord Edgware Dies were American, but it seemed more incidental in that book. That is where they were from, but not a part of their identity, if that makes sense. The Americanness, if you will, seems much more emphasized in Appointment with Death. Anyway, that is my case for an honorable mention for the Boynton family. You make an excellent case, listener, and I think you're right. There is a preoccupation with Americanness in Appointment with Death. And I only mentioned that novel tangentially on my episode, so it really did deserve to be showcased, which is why I appreciate you doing it for me in your message. And then one more communication I received about Appointment with Death from my good friend Michelle Kazmer, previous co-host on the podcast and fellow agathologist extraordinaire. Michelle also noted the fact that I had missed the Boyntons, but as she pointed out, Appointment with Death has the noteworthy feature that both the primary victim and the primary murderer are both Americans, as opposed to Lord Edgware Dies, where the murderer and one of the incidental victims are both Americans. Because it's true, the Boynton family are all Americans, but so is our murderer in Appointment with Death, the officious Lady Westholme, who is a member of Parliament, despite the fact that she was born an American. And this is something that Catherine Brobeck and I touched on in our review of Appointment with Death, but many believe that Lady Westholme was based in part on Lady Astor, who was born an American and went on to become the first woman MP in England. Though I will also note that Christie biographer Janet Morgan refutes this, and she says that Lady Westholme was based on an officious woman Christie had met in her travels, the, quote, excessively fierce-looking Miss Wilbraham, end quote. But regardless of who inspired Lady Westholme, she is an important American in the canon. And if I hadn't forgotten her as well, I think I definitely would have put her somewhere in the lower half of my top dozen Americans in Christie. So thank you, listeners, for filling in the gaping holes there that I left in my All About the Americans episode. But your responses to that episode were not all about the secret adversary and appointment with death. Oh no, there was more. A lot more. Let's read out the next letter. Hello, Kemper. What fun it was to hear you review the nice and the nasty Americans in Agatha Christie. I was surprised not to hear of one of my favorite characters with a British mom and American dad, Alexander Eastleigh from 450 from Paddington. I find him to be one of the most delightful characters in the book and one of the best depictions of childhood in all of Christie. As a bibliophile myself, I love the little scene where Lucy helps Alexander pack and he insists on taking all his books while eating a chocolate bar. I would love to know your thoughts about Alexander and his father, Brian. Well, my thoughts, listener, are that is an excellent point. Alexander Eastleigh is obviously a minor American in the Christie canon, but it is true that, like Christie, he has a British mother and an American father, and his American father, Brian, also features in the story, and they are both delightful. They are two of the more sympathetic Americans to be depicted by Agatha Christie, for sure. Next message. Regarding the van in American names. As you mentioned, there were many Dutch settlers in New England, especially in New York. In Dutch, the van means of or from, and is a signifier of aristocratic origin, like de in French and van in German. The New York social scene was for centuries dominated by the descendants of these families. So when Agatha is adding a van to a name, she is likely implying that not only is the character rich, but well-born. It's all there in Death on the Nile. Jacqueline de Belfort, Marie Van Schuyler, but Lynette Ridgway. There is even a scene in the book where Miss Van Schuyler is asked if she knew Lynette, and I think the response sums it up nicely. Race says, I shall be glad, Miss Van Schuyler, if you will tell me the extent of your previous acquaintance with Mrs. Doyle. There was no previous acquaintance. But you knew of her? I knew who she was, of course. But your families were not acquainted? As a family, we have always prided ourselves on being exclusive, Colonel Race. My dear mother would never have dreamed of calling upon any of the Harts family who, outside their wealth, were nobodies. Oh, that is such a fantastic quotation from Death on the Nile, and very much revealing as to what Christie is doing when she is using those Dutch American van names in her books. And I also got a little more on this from my good friend, Michelle Kazmer. Here's what she had to say about New England versus Middle Atlantic, i.e. British versus Dutch American names. I was just delving into the difference between Middle Atlantic and New England for a book chapter I'm writing about Elizabeth Daly / Henry Gamage. Sounds very interesting. So the difference between British Americans and Dutch Americans is fresh in my mind. There was a very distinct sociocultural distinction drawn between those two groups, so it is perhaps not surprising that Christie leaned on the Dutch American names for her broadly drawn stereotypical Americans rather than the British Americans. That's interesting too, because she was often lampooning these Americans, so perhaps it makes sense that she would have chosen to draw from the Dutch American group as opposed to the group closer to her own, which would be the British Americans. That's really interesting. I find that convincing, and now I'd like to read out a message from another listener who made the exact opposite argument, which I also find convincing. This listener had a really interesting comment on why Agatha Christie might be as satirical as she tends to be when it comes to her American characters. Here's that message. I greatly enjoyed your episode on Americans and Christie and possibly have a thought on why they appear so often. Agatha perhaps gave Americans the more outrageous character descriptions because of being half American. My dad immigrated from Germany. I was born in the States, and I am a writer. Because of my German relatives, I understand German traits versus stereotypes and feel I'm German enough to poke fun at them. I would never do that for attributes which do not belong to me. Agatha may have also felt that making fun of a part of herself was acceptable, while making fun of others was rude, which is why we mostly don't see her targeting other nationalities in the same manner. I really love that, and I never thought about that, but perhaps she did identify with the American half of her ancestry, and she felt that that gave her the standing to poke fun at Americans. I find that to be persuasive. And because it's such a good point, I will indulge this listener by reading out the German joke that ends this message. I will now share my favorite German joke. How many Germans does it take to change a light bulb? Answer: 1. We are efficient and have no sense of humor. I can't be sure, but I think that might be the first time that we've done a light bulb joke on this podcast, which is surprising to me. But anyway, thank you for that interesting and entertaining message, listener. I have one more submission having to do with the Americans of Agatha Christie, and it is coming from Michelle Kazmer once again. Michelle had a lot to say about the All About the Americans episode, and I ate up every word of it. And it turns out that she is a super fan of one Cornelia Robson from Death on the Nile. And I have a feeling there are probably a lot of Cornelia stans out there. So I want to give Cornelia her due here by reading out what Michelle had to say about her. I'm begging you, please, to move Cornelia Robson up. Like, a lot. OMG. Her love triangle is one of the best in the whole oeuvre by way far, and I stand on that. Her conversations with James Fanthorpe are perfect. Her relationship to Lynette Doyle is spectacular. The whole murder hinges on her functioning as a completely honest witness throughout the entire evening. Heck, the entire journey. She is smart and hardworking and is a truly earnest person whose ongoing reckoning with a deeply unearnest world is incredibly poignant. These are some of the most memorable moments of the book. Our uncertainty about whether Dr. Bessner is truly as kind and reliable as Cornelia sees him, or if this is an almost Rebecca-esque situation she's marrying into, adds to the subtlety and depth. And I think that's really true. I had never really thought of Cornelia Robson as one of those moral rocks in a Christie novel, but she does have those characters in her mysteries from time to time, and they really are wonderful characters. And it's true that the Cornelia Robson, Mr. Ferguson, aka Lord Dawlish, Dr. Bessner love triangle, while it is way overshadowed by the much more dramatic love triangle taking place at the center of the mystery, it is executed perfectly and is quite diverting and even poignant. And sometimes on this podcast, Catherine and I would give Christie a hard time for those tacked on romances, but this is not one of those cases. So justice for Cornelia Robson. I love it. All right, let's move on now from the Americans of Agatha Christie to the gays of Agatha Christie. I received this note from, you guessed it, the prolific Michelle Kazmer, who is quickly becoming one of the very best friends of this podcast. She had a few things to say about a few different characters. Here goes. I am treading gently here and defer to you and others whose experience is more central to this discussion. Please take my input for what it's worth. I was so pleased to hear that someone raised the topic of our ace/aro/demi/plus community members. Of course, Poirot loved that in-depth exploration, but I had been thinking of many of our Christie friends, Cecilia Williams among them, and I think this is a beautiful space to think about. I agree with you, Michelle, and I love applying that analysis to Cecilia Williams from Five Little Pigs, who is one of my favorite characters in all of Christie. I think that is ripe for fruitful exploration, so I just wanted to put that out there in the world. Michelle then went on to make a comment about two other characters from Five Little Pigs, Meredith and Philip Blake. And I mentioned Philip Blake in my episode all about the gays of Agatha Christie because he is not explicitly a gay character in Christie's text, though he is made an explicitly gay character in the Agatha Christie's Poirot David Suchet adaptation of that text. And I think it is totally warranted. And here's what Michelle had to say. Philip Blake, but not Meredith? Meredith is coded using some of those same stereotyping words that we rely on elsewhere in Christie, including namby-pamby. Fair enough, Michelle. You make a good point. And then Michelle's longest note by far had to do with the character of Haley Preston. And I had made a general call for people who might have interpreted that scene between Haley Preston and Miss Marple, in which it seems like she is warning him about his homosexuality in perhaps a homophobic way. I had begged people to present a different interpretation of that scene to me, and Michelle obliged. So here's what she had to say. I am more than happy to call Christie and her characters out on anything, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, when appropriate. But I may be the one person in the world who rejects this analysis of that specific interaction between Marple and Haley Preston. There are so many queer-coded characters in Mirror Cracked, and we know Miss Marple in general is pretty relaxed about sexuality. By the time we get to that passage at the end of Mirror Cracked, if Miss Marple was wanting to be outing / blackmailing / threatening / insulting queer folks, she would have done more of it. I read it as Gerald French's unfortunate past, so not an ongoing unfortunate aspect of his person, but a past activity related specifically to his being a smooth talker, perhaps in the confidence / fraud space. Part of the reason I raise this is that this is how I read it when I was a young teen reader in the early 1980s, when angry, violent, explicit homophobia was very much the accepted stance where I grew up in Catholic land, that yes, Haley Preston was a gay character among a bunch of gay characters, but that he in particular reminded Miss Marple of a young man who had participated in nefarious activities in the past associated with his smooth talking. If this were only my 2024 mature reading, I'd let it go. But I remember so vividly reading this one in a completely different cultural context, where the homophobic interpretation would have been the one that most readily came to my mind based on my own context, and it didn't. So there you have it, an alternate reading of that scene by an agathologist who thinks deeply about these texts and has lived with them for decades. I am not personally convinced, but I am comforted by the fact that there is an alternate explanation out there in the world. Thank you, Michelle. Okay, next I have a comment on my 10 Little Poirots and Marples episode, ranking the actors who played Christie's two most famous detectives. I got a response to a response that I found highly entertaining. Here goes. Hello, Kemper. Intrigued by the mention of Hugh Laurie as Poirot in your last Postbag collection. Yes, I have also never watched Spice World, in spite of counting myself a Spice Girls fan. I guess if we count that as a portrayal of Poirot, then we need to count all the other castings of the character in sketches and parodies of various types. Examples might include Ian Holm in Murder by the Book. I'll just pause to note that he was included in that episode. Bobby Davro in Sketchpad, James Coco in Murder by Death, Jason Alexander in The Muppets, and Tom Patrone in Doing Agatha. Not really anything I'd want to check out in that list. I guess another honorable mention has to be Fiona Allen, as Poirot is one of the stage roles adopted by Carlotta in the Suchet adaptation of Lord Edgware Dies. Keep up the good work. See you in Torquay. I look forward to seeing you in Torquay, listener, and thank you for that delightful message. I will not be following up on any of those actors' performances as quote-unquote Poirot. Though I will note that Catherine Brobeck and I did cover Murder by Death on a Patreon episode, and James Coco's rendition of a Poirot-like character is pretty great. It's very funny. Okay, I also heard from a listener in Denmark about the issue of titles and translation. And I thought what she said was very interesting. This is also a call for further listener submissions. So here goes. Being a listener based in Denmark, I've had the pleasure of being able to read Christie in her native language and translated to my own. I find it really interesting how and when these translations were made. Regarding publication history, some of the early novels took years to be translated. We didn't get Styles until 1954, and Orient Express was in 61, though we did randomly get Secret Adversary in 1925 and Man in the Brown Suit in 1926. It looks like Christie didn't become truly popular over here until the late 50s. From then on, only a year or two passed before each novel got a translation. A lot can definitely be said about Christie in translation, and just taking a look at the titles paints an interesting picture. Some of them are translated almost one-to-one. For instance, Body in the Library, Death in the Clouds, and 450 from Paddington are one-to-one the same in both languages. Then, there are some that are fairly different. The Murder on the Links equals The Open Grave. The Secret of Chimneys equals The Letter That Killed. Peril at End House equals Death Lurks. And Then There Were None equals One of Us is the Murderer. Taken at the Flood equals The Dead Returns. And there are a whole bunch of titles that are just questions that don't really tell you anything about the novel. Was she innocent? That would be Sad Cypress. Was it murder? That's Sparkling Cyanide. Was he murdered? That's After the Funeral. And who killed? The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And yes, that sounds as clunky in Danish as in my direct translation. My absolute favorite, though, is Halloween Party, translated to The Wrong Witness, which is such a spoilery title. Such a large part of the puzzle mystery hinges on the fact that Joyce was not, in fact, the true witness, and the title just pointing directly to that seems wild to me. Honestly, I did not get there when I heard the Danish audiobook as a teenager, so maybe it's not so bad. It's crazy to think about how different your first perception of a book is, depending on whether you hear the English or Danish title. And I can only assume the differences within the pages of the novels are monumental as well. I just wanted to geek out over this with a fellow Christie aficionado. It would be cool to hear what the titles are in other countries. Maybe people could send in their favorite translations, and we could see how varied the titles actually are. An alternate title extravaganza! I love that idea, listener. Thank you for writing in about Danish title translations. And if anyone else feels inspired to write in about non-English language title translations, I think it would be really fun, actually, to do a rundown. Maybe I could even cobble together a little quiz in which listeners could guess the title by its translation. Could be fun. So if you would like, please do write in about interesting or curious non-English language titles of Christie books. Okay, we have one more letter in our depleted mailbag here, and it is a seamless transition because I am ending with a listener email that was the genesis for this very episode. Here we go. I hope you are well. We've corresponded briefly before. I'm a longtime listener of the podcast, and it was lovely to meet you briefly after your live recording at the festival in Torquay this past summer. I'm writing as in your most recent episode, you mentioned that you're always happy to hear possible ideas for future podcasts. I wanted to suggest one on Agatha and dogs. Of course, she loved and owned dogs throughout her life, and there's a charming description in her autobiography of how she was so overwhelmed at being given a dog for her 5th birthday that she couldn't speak and had to hide in the bathroom to collect her thoughts. I also really like that one of the captions for a photo in the autobiography is Max and my dog, not our dog. Dogs are key to numerous stories, as you know. Dumb Witness and the Incident of the Dog's Ball, The Nemean Lion, The Capture of Cerberus, Postern of Fate, and the short stories Next to a Dog and The Hound of Death. There are probably more that I've missed from this list. I think it would be a really interesting episode that would be able to look at Agatha's life alongside her writing, and it could be fun to research. Just thought I'd share the idea. You no doubt already have a long list of themes for future episodes. Well, it is true, listener, that I do have a long list, but this was an excellent idea. Thank you so much for writing in. And after much research, I am now ready to talk about the dogs of Agatha Christie, since it is the dog days of summer, after all. And just for fun, let's explore for a moment why it is called the dog days of summer, because I had to look this up. When I was little, I used to think that it was just a reference to the way dogs always seem kind of hot with all their panting and hot mouths and whatnot. Panting is, of course, their way of cooling down. But it seems as though the phrase is actually derived from the stars. Sirius, which is also known as the dog star, appears in the sky just before the sun does, near the end of July, which is the hottest time of year in the northern hemisphere. And for this reason, the Romans referred to this hot period as the days of the dog star, which got shortened over time to dog days. And there you have it. And you know, I happened to be rereading the ABC Murders recently, as one does, which takes place explicitly during the summer of 1935. And in it, Hastings refers to those hot dog days, which personally makes me think of a hot dog and eating Dodger dogs while baking in the summertime sun and watching a baseball game, which I did earlier this summer. It is definitely pretty hot here in Southern California, listeners, as I record this episode with my raging summer cold, though not nearly as hot as it has been in many other parts of the world. I hope everyone is staying safe out there and hydrating as much as possible wherever you are. So let's cool off now, like a panting dog, with a rundown of the canine species in Agatha Christie's oeuvre. But first, in addition to that listener who had the idea for this episode, I want to credit two other people who helped me in my preparations. The first is Kate Jackson, who I had on the podcast a number of months ago when she instructed us all on how to survive an Agatha Christie novel. That was a talk she developed from her book, How to Survive a Classic Crime Novel. Kate is a very active scholar in the community devoted to the golden age of detective fiction. And at the 2021 Agatha Christie Festival, which I did not attend myself, she gave a lecture on animals in classic fiction. I was able to consult a written version of this lecture online, and I will link to it in the notes because I found it invaluable. So I just wanted to give Kate a shout out now. Thank you, Kate. Similarly, I wanted to thank my good friend, Michelle Kazmer, official fairy god person of this episode, and Dean of the College of Communication and Information at Florida State University. She is an expert on information systems and all things Agatha Christie related. You might think there's no overlap between those two areas, but you would be wrong. Just ask Michelle about it. She'll be happy to tell you. Anyway, I asked for Michelle's help in filling any of the gaping holes I will inevitably leave open in this episode, as I did in my All About the Gays and All About the Americans rundowns. And Michelle delivered. She gave me more than a few of the more arcane entries on this list, which is not to say that I'm going to mention every single dog in the Christie canon now. So if I end up missing some of your very favorite doggies or ranking them too low or not talking about them enough, I want you to get in touch with me to tell me about it so that I can read out your message in a future episode. I really love how much listener interaction these ranking episodes have inspired. I definitely plan on doing more of them, more themed ranking exercises. I think they're great fun. It's a different way to analyze the Christie oeuvre in more of a holistic way than title by title, as Catherine and I did when we were engaged in our ranking exercise. So please keep those emails coming. And now let's read out that quote from Agatha Christie's autobiography that my listener referenced about when she received her first dog, because I think it's as good a way as any of proving just how important dogs were to Agatha Christie. On my 5th birthday, I was given a dog. It was the most shattering thing that ever happened to me. Such unbelievable joy that I was unable to say a word. When I read that well-known cliche, so-and-so was struck dumb, I realize that it can be a simple statement of fact. I was struck dumb. I couldn't even say thank you. I could hardly look at my beautiful dog. Instead, I turned away from him. I needed urgently to be alone and come to terms with this incredible happiness. I have done the same thing frequently during my later life. Why is one so idiotic? I think it was the lavatory to which I retired, a perfect place for quiet meditation where no one could possibly pursue you. Lavatories were comfortable, almost residential apartments in those days. I closed the heavy mahogany shelf-like seat, sat on it, gazed unseeingly at the map of Torquay that hung on the wall, and gave myself up to realization. I have a dog. A dog. It's a dog of my own, my very own dog. It's a Yorkshire Terrier, my dog, my very own dog. My mother told me later that my father had been much disappointed by the reception of his gift. I thought the child would love it, he said. She doesn't seem to care about it at all. But my mother, always understanding, said that I needed a little time. She can't quite take it in yet. And oh, listeners, how I love that it was a Yorkshire Terrier that filled young Agatha Miller with so much joy, because I grew up with a Yorkshire Terrier. I come from a family of dog lovers, and from the time I was 7 years old until I was 23, I had a dog, or my whole family had a dog. She was very much a family dog, named Ashley. And as you can see from that age spread, Ashley lived to be quite old. She was 16 when she finally passed away. And I loved her very much. She was only 4.5 pounds. She was a true teacup Yorkie. Very, very tiny, tinier than most cats. But I feel Agatha Miller here on the joy of this Yorkie, the first of many terriers she was to own and love. And interestingly, she tells us in the autobiography that this dog, this Yorkie, was christened George Washington by Christie's American father, but of course. and that her contribution was to nickname him Tony. And what this means, dear listeners, is that from the very beginning of Agatha Christie's experience with the canine species, we have evidence of the bifurcation of dog names that will be repeated over and over again among the fictional dogs within the canon. I was amazed to notice this as I was preparing for this episode, but by and large, the names of Christie's fictional dogs are either grandiose, a la George Washington. Often they're even more Baroque than that. The names of various ancient emperors and whatnot. Or they are what I'm going to call the humdrum human names. Prosaic names like Tony, which sound to my ear like a strange but charming name for a dog. I mean, you could say Ashley is another one of those names, quite honestly, though she was named for her ash gray hair, since Yorkies do have hair, not fur. They're one of the few breeds who don't shed, but I digress. I also found it interesting that one of the photos in Christie's autobiography is of her as a girl at Ashfield sitting outside with her father and her dog. And we know that Christie's father passed away when she was 11. And from the passage I just read, we know that she got her first dog, Tony, when she was 5. So my guess is that this is a picture of Tony. And yet the caption reads, "With my father and my dog, Toby." A typo, I suppose. If anyone knows for sure either way, please write in and let me know. But I think that this is Tony. Though who knows, maybe Tony had an evil twin named Toby. It's also true, as the listener who had the idea for this episode noted, that there is another photo in the autobiography of Max Mallowan with a big old Sealyham terrier on his lap. And that photo is captioned, "Max with my Sealyham, James," just before the Second World War. Hello, James. Another humdrum human name. I love it. And it's true. She really does seem to take personal ownership over these dogs. Though to be fair to her, as we'll soon see in one of the higher entries on my list of dogs, she does refer to her husband, Max, as the quote unquote master of another of the dogs that they cared for together. I will also note that in yet another photo in the autobiography, we see a young Rosalind and Matthew in 1947 posing in Wales with what looks like they might be 2 miniature pinschers. There are just dogs everywhere in that book. And it's very obvious that dogs were a huge part of Agatha Christie's life. She was just a big, big dog lover. So let's get into it now. The top 10 dogs in Agatha Christie, beginning at number 10 and going in ascending order. We start with the Hound of Death. And one of the reasons the dog from the Hound of Death is in last place is that there is no dog in the Hound of Death. This is going to sound a little harsh, but there isn't a whole lot of anything in the Hound of Death. Despite the length of that story, it's quite a long short story of Agatha Christie's, and it is not one of my favorites. The titular Hound of Death is a black mark in the shape of a big hound that appears in the wake of various spooky supernatural happenings instigated by a Belgian nun who seems to have supernatural powers. No, really. So I was going to cover this story on Patreon. I mentioned this in my last episode. It was going to be a companion episode to this one on the regular podcast. But after revisiting the Hound of Death for this list, I decided that I cannot do that to all of you. I am going to cover the Hound of Death at some point in the future, probably during spooky season in October, not during the dog days of summer. Instead, my companion episode on Patreon is going to be the story that sits in the number 1 spot on this list. So stay tuned for what that is. All right, so that is number 10. In 9th place, we have the dog from Mrs. McGinty's Dead. And this dog's name is Ben, one of the better humdrum human names for a dog in Christie. Ben is fat and old and fairly useless, but he's also extremely adorable, and he's a Sealyham Terrier. We know Christie owned Sealyham Terriers for herself. And the fictional owner of this fictional Sealyham is the rather victimized Deirdre Henderson, who ends the book with both a fortune and a bow in the offing. So I have to think that good times are ahead for Ben the dog as well. Deirdre is a sympathetic character, even if she is a bit pitiable. And I think Christie uses Ben to help fill out this characterization. It's also Ben who brings together Deirdre and the hapless James Bentley, who's been falsely convicted of murdering Mrs. McGinty. Poor little Ben got one of his slowpoke little feet stuck in a trap, and James Bentley helps Deirdre get the trap undone. When James Bentley is relaying this story to Poirot, our Papa Poirot matchmaker can tell that James cares about Deirdre. So Ben is the tie that binds here. Also, Mrs. Oliver comments on Ben as a way of starting a conversation with Deirdre, and I love this line from the book. Dogs, Mrs. Oliver considered, were always a means of introduction. Though I will be honest with you, listeners, I did not remember Ben whatsoever. This was all Michelle. Thank you, Michelle, for reminding me of Ben's existence. And I did also appreciate an amusing exchange that exists in the book between Mrs. Oliver and Deirdre about how Sealyhams fight a lot, which is why Deirdre has to keep him on a leash. Terriers in general can be like that. I know that from experience. It's why some people don't like terriers very much, but for those of us who have chosen to have terriers in our lives, I think that fighting spirit is one of our favorite things about the breed. So hooray for Ben, hooray for terriers. And let's move on now to number 8, my 8th dog here. This is another dog that does not technically exist, and it comes from a short story, a Poirot short story, The Adventure of Johnny Waverley. So this is an early Poirot short story that involves the kidnapping of a young boy, and a would-be dog plays a key role in pulling off that kidnapping. I'm just going to quote from the text now, because it's very charming. Poirot and Hastings have discovered a priest's hole, but of course, gotta love those priest's holes, which seems to be where the boy was secreted before he was whisked out of this country house, and they're looking around this space for clues. The tiny room was bare enough. There was not even the mark of a footstep on the floor. I joined Poirot where he was bending attentively over a mark in the corner. What do you make of this, my friend? There were 4 imprints close together. A dog, I cried. A very small dog, Hastings. Palm. Smaller than a palm. A griffin? I suggested doubtfully. Smaller even than a griffin. A species unknown to the Kennel Club. I looked at him. His face was alight with excitement and satisfaction. I was right, he murmured. I knew I was right. Come, Hastings. And then a little later, Poirot is questioning the secretary/companion of the boy's mother, quoting again from the text. Ah, yes, the dog, he smiled broadly. Is there a dog kept here by any chance, mademoiselle? There are 2 retrievers in the kennels outside. No, I mean a small dog, a toy dog. No, nothing of the kind. But we learn soon enough from Poirot that there is a little wordplay going on here, because there are toy dogs in the house. In the nursery, to be specific. Poirot surmises from the tiny footprints that there was a children's toy in the form of a dog put in the priest's hole to keep this little boy, this Johnny Waverley, preoccupied as his own father arranged for it to look as though his son was being kidnapped. It's a neat little trick, and the wordplay with toy dog is something that I find very easy to remember years after having read the story. So for that reason alone, the toy dog in The Adventure of Johnny Waverley earns its spot on this list. Moving on now to number 7. This is not just one dog, but a trio of dogs from Murder is Easy. One of the secondary characters in this book is Major Horton. And the first time that the Major is mentioned in the text, when Luke Fitzwilliam asks Bridget Conway about the men of Witchwood Under Ash, she refers to him as Major Horton and his bulldogs. They really do come as a set. And whenever Luke interacts with Major Horton, his 3 bulldogs are close by. Major Horton is usually either yelling at them to behave or boring the people around him with stories about his dogs. He loves bulldogs in particular. And he is definitely one of those older military men who served abroad among the Anglo-Indian regiments, and he likes to bore people with tales of his exploits, but those 3 bulldogs provide an extra layer of boredom. And I think we can see Christie lampooning herself a bit here, as she liked to do, since I'm pretty sure she could go on for a bit about her own dogs, if given the opportunity. And what are these 3 dogs' names, you might ask? Augustus, Nellie, and Nero. And this is not the last time we will be coming across a dog named Augustus on this list. But this is our first example of the more outrageously named dogs in the Christie canon. Augustus and Nero are, of course, ancient emperors. And then Nellie fits in the other category. This is one of the human humdrum names. And it's really funny that these three form a trio together. Unfortunately, these three bulldogs don't really figure into the plot or have any other significance beyond the character work they do on behalf of Major Horton. If they did, they would be a lot higher in this list because I do like these three bulldogs. They're very amusing, and I appreciate the fact that based on how much he yells at each of them, it seems like Nero may be the least well-behaved, which means he is living up to his namesake. And did I mention that they're show dogs? At one point, Major Horton bores Luke Fitzwilliam with the following information. I'm quoting now from the text. Luke heard of the prizes Nellie had won, of the infamous conduct of a judge in awarding Augustus merely a highly commended, and of the triumphs of Nero in the show ring. Love it, love it, love it. And I just have to point out that the last three entries I've gone through, 9 through 7, are all thanks to Michelle Kazmer and her rather alarming memory of Christie minutia. In fact, you may have noticed that when I announced this episode in my previous episode, I said I was going to devote it to dogs and cats, but Michelle gave me so much material, I realized I had more than enough for dogs alone. So thank you again, Michelle. All right, moving on to number 6. We are back to a Poirot short story. This is The Capture of Cerberus, where we have an actual dog named Cerberus, who stands guard at the front door of London's hottest new nightclub, Hell. And of course, this all makes a lot of sense since Cerberus is the three-headed dog who guarded the underworld in the world of Greek mythology, and Christie is constantly riffing on that world in her Labors of Hercules. The Capture of Cerberus is one of those labors. This is the one story that was not serialized since her original Capture of Cerberus was rejected and not published until John Curran discovered it and published it as an appendix in Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks. But this is the one that appeared in the book collection, The Labors of Hercules. And it's a great story. This Cerberus does not have 3 heads, but he features in the drug smuggling scheme that is central to the shenanigans occurring in this Vera Rosikoff story. Here is how Christie describes the dog. On his left, in a kind of marble grotto, sat the largest and ugliest and blackest dog Poirot had ever seen. It sat up very straight and gaunt and immovable. It was perhaps, he thought and hoped, not real. But at that moment the dog turned its ferocious and ugly head, and from the depths of its black body a low, rumbling growl was emitted. It was a terrifying sound. And we get a little hint as to the breed of this dog when it is described as gaunt, but later in the story it is referred to explicitly as a greyhound. Vera Rosikoff controls this dog by way of whispered Russian phrases, which is fantastic. Cerberus really is an otherworldly kind of a dog, and I think it's perfect that he's a greyhound because greyhounds are super weird looking. I hope that doesn't offend anyone. I'm much more of a small dog person myself, and it seems as though Agatha Christie was as well. But I really love Cerberus, who is quite misused, actually, because we learn that he has been made to secrete drugs between his oversized jaws. Poor doggy. What would happen if that bag of cocaine had ever broken? That would not be good for poor Cerberus. Okay, so that's number 6. We are now heading into our top half in my rundown of the top 10 dogs of Agatha Christie. In 5th place, we have a dog from Elephants Can Remember. And now I went on record when I reviewed this novel with friend of the podcast, Mark Aldridge, that I did not think this was one of Christie's better novels. It feels like one of her more muddled stories where the characters don't quite come to life. So much of this book is Ariadne Oliver and friends going around to people and asking them to think back a number of years about events they kind of sort of remember. And the whole thing feels like a failed exercise in memory. So perhaps it's not a coincidence that I believe this is the only dog on my list whose breed is never specified and who does not get named. And I think that's significant. Agatha Christie never missed an opportunity to name the dogs in her stories, and yet this dog is never identified. Now, I could be wrong about this. Elephants Can Remember is an incredibly difficult book to fact check because I will be honest with you, it's a difficult book to keep straight in one's head, given the muddle of it, and it's even a difficult book to scan due to its meandering nature. I did scan it, and the references to the dog that I found were general, with no name, no breed. But if anyone out there does know this dog's name and or breed, if I did miss it somehow, please write in to allaboutthedame@gmail.com and I will correct the record. But I think it's in keeping with the muddled and sort of tell, don't show ethos of this book that the dog is not named, especially since this dog is actually key to the solving of the mystery underlying this story. It is the dog who knows that we've got a twins switcheroo on our hands here. The dog knows that the woman everyone is pretending is Molly is actually Dolly. The evil twin has been substituted for the good twin since the evil twin killed the good twin, and the good twin's husband is preparing a way to mercifully end the evil twin's life, thereby saving the family name by way of a would-be marital murder-suicide, because that makes a whole lot of sense. But anyway, the dog is the one that Poirot notes was smart enough to know these two women had been switched. And I believe I mentioned this at the time when I was reviewing Elephants Can Remember, but it reminds me of a great moment early on in The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, one of my very favorite novels, when a dog who is normally very friendly growls at a character who is putting himself out there to be good, but who in fact turns out to be one of the blackest hearted of all characters in that novel. I like the way Christie uses a dog's instincts here to help solve the mystery. It's the execution I take issue with in this story, but I think the dog is very well used. It's one of the best aspects of the novel. All right, in fourth place, we have what is probably the most obvious entry on this list, and that is the dog from Dumb Witness / The Incident of the Dog's Ball. Dumb Witness was originally written as a short story titled The Incident of the Dog's Ball, and then later expanded into a full-length novel. And this dog, I think, takes the blue ribbon, for the best of the humdrum human-named dogs. His name is Bob, and he is our central victim, Miss Arundel's faithful companion. He is a fox terrier. And interestingly, even though the humans' names change between the short story and the novel version of this story, Bob's name remains consistent. And we really get two humdrum human names for the price of one here, because the book is dedicated to Dear Peter, most faithful of friends and dearest of companions, a dog in 1,000. Peter was not a fox terrier. He was a wire-haired terrier. And this is actually not the first book that Christie dedicated to him. She also dedicated That Rotten Book, those are Christie's words, The Mystery of the Blue Train, to Peter nearly 10 years earlier in 1928. That is the book that she had to force herself to finish in the aftermath of her disappearance and the breakdown of her first marriage, and it's worth reading out that dedication. To the two distinguished members of the OFD, Carlotta and Peter. Carlotta, aka Carlo, aka Charlotte Fisher, was Christie's faithful secretary, and the OFD was a private joke between them. It stood for the Order of the Faithful Dogs. And the idea was that any of Christie's friends who were still loyal to her after everything that had happened in those dark years belonged to this Order of the Faithful Dogs. Peter really did mean a lot to Agatha Christie. I actually talk about this a bit more in my companion Patreon episode. But I'll note here that according to her first official biographer, Janet Morgan, one of the reasons that Christie was perhaps so attached to pets in her early childhood is that she was left alone very often. Her two siblings were much older, and her parents were definitely not helicopter parents. They did not hover. And so she relied on various pets, not just dogs. She also had birds, for example. She would rely on them for companionship, and that was a habit that was firmly established as she moved on into adulthood, which is why, as far as I know, she was really never without a canine companion. Peter, I will note, died in 1938, only 1 year after this book came out. And I'm not sure how old he was, but given that he had to have been alive in 1926 during her disappearance, that means he had to have been at least 12. So I'm sure Christie was quite attached to him. And his fictional counterpart, Bob, is adorable. I have no beef with Bob per se. What I do have a beef with is that Bob is not actually a witness to the murder that happens in the book. I feel like the title Dumb Witness makes a promise that the book does not deliver on, and it really annoys me. The Suchet adaptation at least tries to deliver on this promise. That adaptation features an adorable dog actor named Snubby, who is a fox terrier, just as Bob is specified to be in the text. And Snubby's version of Bob actually does see the murderer laying her trap, unlike in the book. I just really wanted Bob to see more. And I should also note that there is another dog in Dumb Witness. There's a dog named Spot, who is the butcher's dog. All right, moving on to our top 3 spots now. The recipient of our bronze medal is Hannibal from Postern of Fate. This might be the only aspect of Postern of Fate that works. Because it is the only instance where the thin patina that existed between Christie and her fictional musings or meanderings in this final novel of hers to be written, I think it's the only instance where that thinness proved to be charming rather than distressing. It's pretty obvious that when the elderly Tuppence goes on and on about her Manchester Terrier Hannibal, that these are the elderly Christie's precise thoughts about her Manchester Terrier Bingo. And I think it's significant that, unlike in the case of Dumb Witness, the breed of dog here is exactly the same. It's a Manchester Terrier, both in real life and in fiction. And Christie and her publishers actually chose to double down on this similarity by featuring a picture of the real life Bingo on the inside flap of the first UK edition of the book, with a caption identifying him as Hannibal. Art imitating life. The dedication of Postern of Fate charmingly reads, "For Hannibal and his master," which means that this is the 3rd book of Christie's dedicated to a dog. I should also note that Bingo was actually Christie's 2nd Manchester Terrier. Her first, who was named Treacle, died in 1969. And see, now, Treacle is exactly the sort of cute, non-human name that I think pops up in real life all the time where pets are concerned, but not so much in Christie's fictional worlds. Just wanted to point that out. Okay, so one thing that we do have to deal with in Postern of Fate, and also in my previous entry on this list, Dumb Witness, is the direct portrayal of doggy thoughts on the page. Both these novels feature the doggy thoughts of Hannibal and Bob. It is not my favorite thing in all of Christie. Here's a taste from Postern of Fate. Hannibal acknowledged the privilege by grunting and sniffing in various tufts of grass with which the pavement next to the wall was adorned. If he could have used human language, it was clear that what he would have said was, "Delicious, very rich, big dog here, believe it's that beastly Alsatian." Low growl. "I don't like Alsatians. If I see the one again that bit me once, I'll bite him. Ah, delicious, delicious, very nice little bitch here. Yes, I'd like to meet her. I wonder if she lives far away. Expect she comes out of this house. I wonder now." It's all just a little ridiculous for my taste, but your mileage may vary. I will say this in defense of Hannibal and Postern of Fate, and this is the big reason that I am putting Postern of Fate above Dumb Witness. Hannibal actually plays a role in the solving of the wafer-thin, late-arriving mystery in this bewildering mess of a late thriller. From the moment that she is introduced in the story, which is about 20 pages before she is unmasked as the murderer, and yes, I am using air quotes there, Hannibal cannot stand Miss Mullins, who is our quote-unquote murderer. And that means, as we learned in Elephants Can Remember, that Miss Mullins cannot be trusted. Hashtag believe dogs, listeners. Believe dogs. Also, this book ends with Hannibal being faux knighted by Mr. Robinson, our shadowy government operative who works on the side of good. And here is Tuppence's reply to that. "Count Hannibal, isn't that lovely? What a proud dog you ought to be." And that is the last thing Christie ever wrote. And isn't it fitting that this final line is about a dog that Christie isn't even trying to pretend isn't her own dog, who was probably sitting right there with her while she was writing those lines? I like it. And just as a second dog made a cameo in Dumb Witness, we also have a second dog whose dialogue is recorded in these pages. That would be James, a former dog of Tommy and Tuppence's. I mean, she's just using the name of her actual dog, and she even specifies that he is, quote, a cilium of obstinate nature with a heavy sausage-like body. So this is just Christie's actual dog, James here, who makes an appearance in this story. And I will spare you his dialogue. All right, it is time for our silver medalist, our number 2 dog in the Christie canon. And here's where we get our second Augustus on this list. It is time to talk about the Pekingese Augustus from the Nemean Lion. Augustus also appears briefly by way of reference in The Flock of Geryon. So we are back to the labors of Hercules here. And I have to say, in revisiting this story, I was reminded how fabulous and underrated it is. It is criminal that this story in particular did not get its own adaptation within the Suchet series. And then instead we got that hodgepodge mess of the labors of Hercules in the final season. I just would have loved to have seen the doggy hijinks here. I think David Suchet would have had so much fun. And I really would have loved for Amy Carnaby to be properly celebrated because she is such a great character. Amy Carnaby is the owner of Augustus, and she is the mastermind of a criminal plot that makes use of the intelligence and talent of this little Pekingese dog. But before I get into that, I think we can really see Christie's personal preference for dogs here in that it would have been much cleaner for a domesticated cat to have been used in reference to the titular Nemean lion. I mean, lions are cats, after all. It's a little bit of an awkward fit pretending that Pekingese dogs look like little lions, but Christie pulls it off because she's so good at this sort of thing. Augustus is not the only fabulously named Pekingese in this story. We also have Shantung and Nenki Poo, not to be confused with Wonky Poo from Murder is Easy, who is a cat, and who I will get to on a future cat-centric episode, have no fear. So Augustus is the Pekingese dog who is used as a decoy, as a stand-in for the various Pekingese dogs Amy Carnaby and her sister Emily hold for ransom, collecting fees from various rich ladies around London who all own their own Pekingese dogs. Because while Amy and Emily can easily see the difference between the regal, intelligent Augustus and all those inferior Pekes, and let's just skip right over the stuck-in-his-time comparison to humans that they make in the text, the rest of the populace cannot, and so they exploit this shortcoming. It is very much a dog lover's scheme. And what I really love is that Poirot, that extrajudicial maverick, not only lets Amy Carnaby off scot-free, he actually gives her back the ransom money that she has made as a result of this criminal enterprise. I really think Amy Carnaby is one of the better minor characters in Christie, and I suspect Christie did as well because we see her again. She's a rare crossover character in another one of the labors of Hercules, that would be The Flock of Geryon, where we hear about how Augustus has been doing. It seems that Amy and Emily have taught him a new trick. And I'm quoting now from the text. This is Amy Carnaby speaking. We say, die for Sherlock Holmes, die for Mr. Fortune, die for Sir Henry Merivale, and then die for Monsieur Hercule Poirot. And he goes down and lies like a log, lies absolutely still without moving until we say the word. Which I'll note is very similar to what Cerberus does in the capture of Cerberus. He too can remain motionless for hours. But Poirot is very gratified. And my last comment on the story is something that I did not pick up on until I was doing research for this episode, but I mentioned a previous Augustus on this list. That would be one of Major Horton's 3 bulldogs. And given that repetition, I wondered if these 2 stories may have possibly been written around the same time. And wouldn't you know, this story, The Nemean Lion, was first serialized in November 1939, while Murder is Easy was first serialized in November 1938. And it's always very difficult to know precisely when Christie wrote her stories, since she wrote so much and so often and so quickly. But I think it's fair to say that these 2 stories couldn't have been written too far apart which perhaps accounts for the repetition of that name. It was just a really good name. There's no way these two Augustuses are the same, since one is a bulldog and one is a Pekingese. But I love that the name was so nice, she had to use it twice. They are soul brothers, if you will, the bulldog and the Peke. All right, it is time to crown our gold medalist, our top dog among the canines of Agatha Christie. And this one might come as a little bit of a surprise to listeners because it is a dog from a Christie story that is not very widely read. The story is Next to a Dog, which was first serialized in Grand Magazine in September 1929. It was not collected in either the US or the UK until much later, and I really don't think it is all that well known even to this day. And this is the story that I am covering on Patreon for August. I normally post my Patreon episodes on the 5th of the month, but I have decided to post that episode early to coincide with the airing of this episode. I have also decided to make the episode free for the next 2 weeks to anyone who joins Patreon. So even if you just become a free member, which means you don't have to pay any sort of a fee, there's no monthly subscription. If you want to become a free member, you will get access to this episode. I didn't want to put this story behind a paywall for anyone who wanted to learn more about it, since it is in the top spot here. And I encourage you all, if you're interested in getting the full rundown on Next to a Dog, head on over to Patreon. There's a link in the notes, and you don't have to pay a dime if you don't want to. So this story features a dog named Terry, who is, wait for it, a terrier. He is a wire-haired terrier, to be exact. And here we have yet another fabulous humdrum human-named dog, who, like Bob and Ben and others, is held very dear by his owner. And allow me to remind you, Christie's beloved Peter, who certainly seems to be her most beloved dog, having gotten her through her worst time and garnered 2 book dedications, Peter is a wire-haired terrier, just like Terry. And he was Christie's dog when she was writing this story. So there is zero doubt in my mind that even more so than Bob or any of Christie's other fictional dogs, Terry truly is Peter. Madame Bovary, c'est mon chien. Sorry, I couldn't resist. And the reason that Terry gets the top spot here really has a lot more to do with the relationship between him and his owner than it does with the depiction of Terry himself. Because it's clearly Christie's real-life relationship with Peter. And I just have to say, oh my God, is this relationship an intimate and a loving one, listeners? If you are a dog lover, if you are someone who refers to your dog as a fur baby, for example, you need to read this story. It is beautiful. So just in the broadest of strokes, since again, you can listen to the full rundown on Patreon, and this episode is already long enough. Next to a Dog is a story about a woman named Joyce Lambert who makes the ultimate sacrifice for her beloved dog, Terry. She sacrifices her own honor and sense of decency so that she can keep this dog with her and continue to care for him. And just when this story is at its lowest point, it is Terry who is the means of Joyce's salvation and ultimately her happiness. That's a little bit of an extrapolation since so much of this story is sad, but it is extremely heartfelt and moving. There are no murders in this story, no mysteries other than the greatest mystery of all, the mystery of the heart. This is very much a Mary Westmacott short story, similar to Magnolia Blossom and While the Light Lasts, both of which I also covered on Patreon. But for once, the focus of the story is squarely on the bond between a human and dog. And I think it's fitting that this sentimentally beautiful and beautifully sentimental story take the top spot among all those involving dogs in the canon of Agatha Christie, because it is truly all about the dog.
don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
You didn't think I was done talking about dogs in Agatha Christie, did you? I, of course, have some honorable mentions to go through. First, we have the dog from The Moving Finger. After all the nastiness swirling around Limstock, including the rather depressingly sordid murder at that book's center, we get this nice final chapter in which the air is cleared and all is going to be okay in this poisonous little village. And one of the super nice things that happens is that we learn Joanna, the sister of our first-person narrator, Jerry, has bought him and his newlywed bride, Megan, quote, an outsize Old English sheepdog, end quote. I mean, I still don't think it beats that fluffy woolly thing that we don't know what it's for from Miss Marple, but it's the thought that counts. And this is a rare big dog in the Christie canon. We have a few, but we don't have many. Obviously, this English sheepdog is a super minor dog, which is why it only gets an honorable mention. And honestly, listeners, there are so many other incidental dogs in the canon. The mysterious Mr. Quinn himself has a little dog named Hermes. We've got the humdrum human named Dawn in Towards Zero, and a crucial reference to another dog in that book named Old Bouncer. We've got Lucinda in The Rose and the Yew Tree. Yes, there are dogs in Mary Westmacott novels too. Henry in Sleeping Murder. Another dog named Henry, though this one has a last name. His full name is Henry Footit in the Miss Marple short story Death by Drowning. We've got the red setter named Cutie, who is owned by the Mrs. Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd in A Murder is Announced. That is one of the few dogs whose name does not fall into either the humdrum human or outrageously grandiose categories. We've got Ned and Rover in the short story The Coming of Mr. Quinn, Sheila in The Pale Horse, the spaniel Betsy in Death in the Clouds, Elizabeth in the Seven Dials mystery. We even have a short story, The Edge, which is another outlier of a short story, like Next to a Dog, which wasn't collected in book form until very late, which uses a woman's concern over her injured dog as the catalyst for the action of the story. I haven't actually covered The Edge yet for the podcast, so we have that one to look forward to, but really the dog is more incidental in that one, especially compared to Next to a Dog. The point is that dogs abound in Christie, and while we could quibble over which ones are more important than others, and I encourage you to quibble, email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. The important thing is that they are a consistent element within the fictional world Christie created, just as they were a consistent element within Christie's reality. And so it's no surprise that we have not just a great number of dogs, but a great variety of dogs featured among these stories. Just look at all these different breeds. The Sealyham Terrier, the Bulldog, the Greyhound, the Fox Terrier, the Manchester Terrier, the Pekingese, the English Sheepdog, the Spaniel, the Setter. That is quite a menagerie. And if all of this is music to your ears, if you are jonesing for even more dog content, I do also have to recommend a delightful little mystery confection that I explored over on Patreon. It was an episode of the old Crown Court TV series, and it's titled Evil Liver. It was written by Niall Marsh, and it stars Joan Hickson as a cat lover who has been feuding with her dog-loving neighbors to the point where a dog was actually killed and there was potentially the attempted murder of a person. The episode plays out in court, so we don't see any of this. Have no fear. There is no animal cruelty depicted here. But if you like dogs in your mysteries and are looking for a meditation on the differences between cat lovers and dog lovers, check out the Evil Liver episode of Crown Court. You can find it on YouTube. In fact, I will include a link in the notes. Okay, I have just one final novel of Christie's to mention in relation to dogs, and that is her third published novel and second Poirot novel, The Murder on the Links. So throughout this book, the French inspector, Monsieur Giraud, is compared to a foxhound, to the point where we get this great moment at the end of the story when all has been solved and Poirot and Hastings are back in London, and Hastings notices a new foxhound bust adorning Poirot's mantelpiece, and Poirot tells him that he calls the statue Giraud. Thank you once again, Michelle Kazmer, for this arcane reference I never would have remembered on my own. And this puts me in mind of the fact that inspectors are often compared in mysteries to foxhounds or bloodhounds due to the hound's ability to track, which is why it's interesting to me that more often than not, Christie chose to use a very different animal allegory where her two most famous detectives were concerned. But that, dear listeners, is fodder for a future episode all about the cats of Agatha Christie. The cat people among us out there who may have been shaking their heads sadly over the course of this episode, you will have your day, dear cat-loving listener, in a future episode of the podcast. And I really can't wait, given how much fun I just had talking about the dogs of Agatha Christie. I feel like the end button of this episode should just be a series of woof, woof, arf, arf, arf dog sounds. Given how deep I just went on dogs in Christie, I'm going to have to go chew on a bone or something. But I hope you all enjoyed that. It was great fun to do. And thank you again to Kate Jackson and to Michelle Kazmer and to the listener whose idea it was to do this episode, and to all of the listeners who write in. I really do encourage you all to email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. For my next episode, I will be interviewing Kate Gingold, author of Agatha Annotated, Investigating the Books of the 1920s. This is a book that is all about the obscure terms and historical references in the works of Agatha Christie. I think it's going to be of great interest to many of you. Very excited to speak with Kate. And as I have already mentioned several times, there's bonus content over on Patreon. I've included a link in the show notes. If you feel inclined, please join us over there. Lots more fun to be had over on Patreon. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Books, and you can still buy my debut mystery novel, The Busybody, in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia and New Zealand. I have provided some easy purchase links in the show notes for you. Please take a moment to rate and or review the podcast wherever you are listening to it. It is greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.